this morning from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, and verses 13 to 15, and I'm reading from the NIV. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Verse 13. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation.
Thanks, Dave, for reading that for us. My name's Steve, short for Stephen, which means, good morning, hi, which means crown or king. Kevin, do you know what your name means?
It means kind, gentle, and handsome.
What does it really mean, Kevin?
Kind, gentle, and handsome.
Okay, we'll go with that, I don't know. Yvonne, do you know what your name means?
Archer.
Archer?
An archer.
An archer. Okay. Adrian?
I don't know.
Okay. Jacob? Yeah. Jacob's name means one who grabs the heel. One who grabs the heel. Like Jacob and Esau, right? So Jacob grabbed Esau's heel. So we didn't choose that name for him because he was a heel grabber. We chose that name for him because we liked the name. So I'm going to ask you this morning, if somebody was going to name you based on who you are, what would they call you? And I have a story of one of our kids, and I won't say who it is because Benji gets really embarrassed. Oh. But there was one time we'd been traveling and we got back, and he was 2 or 3 at the time. He was very young. And he was in the car seat, and he'd just been asleep. And I'm picking him out of the car seat. I would say, come on, Dopey. And he says, I'm not dopey. Okay, come on, Sleepy. I'm not sleepy. And I probably went through all of the 7 dwarfs at that point. And every time he's like, I'm not. And then I went, come on, handsome. And he went, I'm not. I'm handsome. So maybe we should change his name to Kevin. And when we were in YWAM, we knew a Nigerian family, and they had 2 girls called Prosper and Perfection. Right? I don't know what it's like to grow up. Anyway, they went back to Nigeria. They didn't stay in England for long. Because in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament especially, the names that people had described who they were. And because of that tradition, that's why Jesus renamed disciples, renamed people, right? He said, you're no longer Simon, you're the rock on which I'm going to build my church. You're Peter. And we find similar things with the names of God. At different times through the Old Testament, God is described through different aspects of his nature and given different names accordingly. And that's partly what we're looking at today in our series on faith and knowledge. That story that Dave read to us, the narrative of the burning bush, it reveals a lot about the nature of who God is. Now, you remember with Moses, he'd had a very privileged upbringing. He'd been brought up in the house of Pharaoh, and Moses was a murderer. He killed an Egyptian, and he ran away to Midian. So he ran away from Egypt to what would be Saudi Arabia today. And he finds himself at a well. And as he's sitting at this well, the 7 daughters of Jethro come to feed, to water their flock. And they get chased away by shepherds. So Moses chases the shepherds away. And anyway, the girls go back to their dad and tell them the story. And they're like, well, where is this guy? So they go and they bring Moses back. And Jethro gives him Zipporah, one of his daughters, to be his wife. It's a classic boy meets girl kind of story. But now it's Moses' job to look after the sheep. So Moses is, and I don't really get how he did this, but he's in Saudi Arabia, and he manages to go all the way to southern Egypt to Mount Horeb, right? So he's really taken these sheep for a long walk. And so he finds himself at Mount Horeb. Now, Mount Horeb is also Mount Sinai, right? Same mountain, different names, probably depending on who you worshipped. Horeb is somehow related to the sun. Sinai is somehow related to the moon. So they have different names based on presumably which god was being worshipped there at any given time. And it's safe to assume that Moses was exposed to many gods through his time in Egypt, also through his Hebrew birth. But not only that, we're told that Jethro was a priest. We're not really too sure who he was a priest of. But we know that in Midian, Baal was one of the gods that was worshipped. So it's probably safe to assume that for somebody like Moses, he was a polytheist. He believed in many different gods. And here he is at the mountain of God, Horeb or Sinai. And we're told that the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire. And the way that the narrative describes Moses' reaction is, I will turn aside and see this great sight. And so he does. And the angel of the Lord, we're told, is the angel of the Lord, not an angel of the Lord. And so I ask, is there a difference between the angel of the Lord and God himself? Because this is somewhat of a physical manifestation of God. And when we look at the term the angel of the Lord throughout the Old Testament, we find that he appeared to Abraham, Balaam, Deborah, Gideon, Samson's parents, Elijah, and David. But not just an angel, but as a physical manifestation of God. And we're told in verse 4, when the Lord, that's Yahweh, saw that he turned aside, God, Elohim, called to him out of the bush. So we're told that this is the angel of the Lord appearing as a burning bush, but we're also told that this is the Lord and God. So we're told a lot about the character of who God is that's meeting with Moses at this moment. But the problem that we've got is that when Moses meets with God later on, it's after he's got the 10 Commandments. This is when Moses wants to see God, right? I think he just needs spurring on. He's so sick of having to babysit these Israelites. He wants God to reveal something of himself. And God says to him, you cannot see my face and live. So we've got that aspect of God's personality, of God's nature. And we've got the aspect of God's nature where you can meet him face to face. And we see them both in Exodus. So this is an appearance of God, as it was to many others in the Old Testament as well, in a physical form, which is apparently okay. So we've got this narrative of what happened to Moses and burning bush, and we've got a parallel passage. Depending on how you were brought up, whether you were brought up with VeggieTales or the Bible, this is Shadrach, and Benny, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this is after they've been taken into exile, after Judah has been taken into exile by Babylon. And they're told to worship the giant chocolate bunny, or the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar has erected. Now, it's important to note that whenever you've got these statues, right, whenever we read of, even like with the golden calf, they weren't worshipping the object itself. They were worshipping the God that would come down and inhabit this object. So Nebuchadnezzar has built this golden statue that he wants everybody to worship, bow down to. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down. And Nebuchadnezzar says, well, if you continue to refuse to bow down, I'm going to throw you into the furnace. And so he does, because they refuse to bow down. And so they're thrown into this furnace, which is hotter than any furnace has ever been. And then we read this in Daniel 3. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked the advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. So we've got an unconsuming fire in both of these narratives. And we've got the angel of the Lord and somebody who's like a son of the gods. That's how Nebuchadnezzar describes what he sees. Now, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar is drawing attention that there are many gods out there. But this God, their God, is the Most High God. And of course, this completely changes the way that the Babylonians worship. And so we've got many similarities between these two passages. If we go back to Moses and the situation that he found himself in, God tells him to go, right? He sends him out. He sends him back to Egypt to set the people, the Hebrews, free. And then we've got this kind of awkward interchange. You know, like when you meet somebody and you introduce yourself and they tell you their name, and then you immediately forget their name. And then you have to do their if I was to write your name down, how would I spell that? Or something like that, right? You've got to find some kind of subtle way of getting them to say what their name is. So Moses, he says, if they ask, what is the name of the one who sent me? Who shall I say? Is it Mr. Bush? Mr. Burning Bush? Who is it? And God says, I am has sent me to you. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, or more specifically, I be who I be. He's unchanging. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the God from the history of the Hebrews. This is my name forever. That's the God of the future of the Jews of the church. But also to Moses, in that very moment, I am. He's unchanging from past, present to future. I am has sent me to you. That's what God says to tell them. So Moses isn't like, oh, which one is that then? No, he knows. At this point, he knows. He has met with God. He's met with Yahweh. He knows exactly who this is. This is the one true God, the God of gods, the God who was, the God who is, and will always be. This is the Hebrew God, Yahweh. This is the God who made a covenant with Abraham. This isn't the first mention of Yahweh by name in the Bible. Actually, we can go right back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, when through the creation of Adam, we find that this is Yahweh who's created Adam and has set him to work in the garden. And as we continue to read through Genesis, you get to chapter 11, and you get the narrative of Abraham. Right? This is the beginning of the history of Israel. Chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11. It's the beginning of the history of Israel, because this is when Yahweh reveals himself to Abraham and makes a covenant with him. Everything that happens before that, Genesis 1 to chapter 10, is a great epic of historical significance to the Israelites. But it's not part of the Israelite history. It's prehistory. And it covers a massive timeline. And at some point in that massive timeline, there's Adam, the very first in the line of Jesus. And that's where we find the first time the name Yahweh. It's in the creation of the first person in the line of Jesus. And now it's interesting when you look at the genealogies, because Matthew, who's a Jew, writing to a Jewish audience, traces Jesus' line back to Abraham. But Luke, who's writing to a Gentile, traces Jesus' genealogy back to Adam, who he calls the Son of God. And what we've got to remember, of course, as well, is what Jesus said about himself. Before Abraham was, I am. So understand what Jesus is saying and understand why the Pharisees freaked out at him saying that. Because God didn't change when Jesus arrived. Jesus was there creating Adam. He was there talking to Moses. He's the physical manifestation of God that later became much more recognizable in the person of Jesus. Before Abraham was, Yahweh, I am. God says to Moses, I am Yahweh. This is my name forever, to all generations. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The Spirit is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's not polytheism. That's monotheism with Trinitarian, that's Trinitarian monotheism. One nature, three persons, the same always. God tells Moses to go, and he's faithful in his sending. Because God is always faithful to those who put their faith in him. Or to those who put their faith in him, he is always faithful. Because do you remember that time when God let Israel down? It was in, nope, didn't happen. Didn't happen, that's right. Because God is always faithful. It is his nature to be faithful. Even in exile, that's where we hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're in exile from the promised land, right? Because the people have been unfaithful to God. But who shows up to those who are faithful to him? God does. He's always faithful to those who are faithful to him. So we can have faith. We can have faith in his faithfulness. Because he is faithful, we can have faith. Those two things go hand in hand. In Hebrews 11, we've got this passage which we call the heroes of the faith. And why are they heroes? And we're told they're heroes because they had faith even though they didn't necessarily see the fulfillment of God's promises to them. For Moses, we find that in Hebrews 11, verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. That was what happened at the burning bush, right? He saw God who was invisible. There was a manifestation of God who shouldn't be visible, because when you see him, you die, according to what he says later in Exodus. So I'm going to read a little bit of Hebrews chapter 11, just so we've got an idea of who these heroes of the faith were. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Okay, all good so far, right? So if you follow Jesus, if you have faith in God, everything's going to work out great. Let's just leave it at that. Oh, wait. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering around in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. God provided something better than the promises that he'd given to him at any given point. What could be better than a promise that God gives to you? Or maybe a greater promise. So how do we know that we can trust our faith? Because God has been faithful. He is faithful, and he always will be. It's his nature, and the nature is something that cannot change. There's never been a break in God's faithfulness since the very beginning, because he is faithful to those who have faith in him. There has always been a remnant. There's always been a people that have followed God, that have followed Yahweh, that have followed Jesus. There's always been that since the very beginning. Elijah on Mount Horeb thought he was the last of the prophets, and that Ahab and Jezebel had killed all of the rest of them. And he's like, I'm the only one left. And God's like, well, actually, you're not. But thank you for turning to me anyway. Because I think if that was me, and I saw everybody else being killed off, I'd probably start to second guess my career choice at that point. But not Elijah. The first place that he turns is back to Yahweh, is back to God. And God was faithful, and he sent him back and gave him the things that he didn't necessarily ask for, but got anyway. Jezebel and Ahab were defeated, and then Elisha came alongside him to be his right-hand man. Now, let's not kid ourselves, right? In today's world, we have a very polytheistic world that we live in. There are many gods, and I'm not just talking about organized religion. I'm talking about many views of who God is. But there can only be one correct view. There can only be one correct understanding of who God is, and that is in the person that we meet of Jesus. Never has there ever been anyone like Jesus. He is unique. He is faithful. And we can put our faith in him because he's faithful. He's faithful enough to die for each and every one of us, so that whoever believes in him will have eternal life. You put your faith in him, and he has been, is, and will be faithful. So, as we read in that passage there, putting your faith in Jesus is not going to be comfy, cozy for everyone. It might be enough to put many people off, because Moses himself was not keen to do what God told him to do. God sent him back to Egypt, and Moses was like, is there anything else I can do? Is there anybody else you can send in my place? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when Nebuchadnezzar orders them to bow down to the statue or be thrown into the furnace, this is what they say. This is their response. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up." He will deliver us. One way or another, we're going to be delivered. Death or life, we're going to be delivered from this furnace. Even if God doesn't save me, I will be faithful. Even if God doesn't save me like I think would be great if he did save me out of this fiery furnace, I'm still going to be faithful. Because God will ultimately save. Jesus has saved you. You can put your faith in him because he is faithful. It's in his nature, yesterday, today, and forevermore. Amen.
There are many kinds of songs and hymns in church. One of them is the anthem that states clearly